Good evening, everybody. So today in October Sky, we are going to read chapter 21, Zincoshine, and what this chapter is referring to. Remember, in the last chapter, Odell and the boys had gone to dig up steel pipe from underneath where some old railroad tracks were that they had taken up. Remember, they've been taking up some of the railroad tracks in Coalwood, which is an indication that the business is starting to die down. But remember, they're needing to earn money for their zinc sulfur, and they don't have it. Plus, remember, they still have a debt to pay back because of the old coal mine phones that they had taken from the barn, that they had borrowed from the barn, and they'd worked out a deal that they would pay back the money for that. So finding this steel piping supposedly is supposed to be worth $1 a pound. Well, remember, they realized after they dig it all up that it wasn't worth what they thought it was. They had dug up, remember, 400 pounds. And they end up sort of being in debt after they subtracted their expenses and everything. So their good old friend Jake Mosby came through and said, I can tell you what, guys, I'll pay off the debt if you will just wax and take care of my Corvette and keep it clean for me. And Jake was good, true to his word. And they ended up making enough money to pay off their debt and to buy the zinc sulfur that they have been wanting. So now they are ready to launch OC 22. So guys, we're going to start on page 312 and be ready to mark key points as I point them out. Now is the time for greater strides. With Quentin and Billy back in the fall, we gathered at Cape Coalwood to test the first of our zinc sulfur rockets. Our machinists were there along with Reverend Richard and at least 100 other Coalwood citizens. The Reverend beckoned me over and took off his hat. "Been praying for you, boy," he said. "Knew you needed it." He told me then that he had had a dream. He had seen men on the moon, and I was one of them. When he woke, he had opened his Bible, and his eyes had fallen on the Testament of Peter. Nevertheless, we, according to his promise, look for new heavens and a new earth, wherein dwelleth righteousness, he quoted. So, of course, he's referring to Sonny, because remember, Sonny is wanting to go out of Coalwood. He's wanting to be in space with these men he admires so much. And so he's kind of saying, Sonny, I just had a dream, and you're going to be one of those guys up there looking for new places. "I hope that's so, sir," I told him, and he looked pleased. We loaded the rocket on the pad by holding it upside down, tapping the casement with a hammer to get the gray powder to settle as we poured it in. When I pushed the ignition button, OC 22 detonated on the launch pad, sending shards of steel deep into the slack and a boil of greenish-white smoke into the air. Had we already passed the critical dimension for our new propellant? I couldn't believe it. There was something else wrong. The crowd wandered over to help us study the fragments like tea leaves. "Guess the Lord didn't want this one to fly," Reverend Richard said, while I turned a piece of jagged steel over and over in my hands, looking for some clue as to what had happened. When our audience drove away, we had a BCMA meeting. Our conclusion was we didn't know what we were doing with the new propellant. No fingers were pointed. It was just the way it was. So you need to know that it had exploded, and basically it had to do with the new propellant they were using. I went home that night unhappy and confused. Mom gave me a look as I crossed the kitchen. I knew she had something to say. "What?" I asked her. "The company's selling the houses," she said. In the fall of 1959, the television and newspapers were filled with stories about American rockets roaring successfully into the sky. "A-OK, we have liftoff, all systems go." The language of our rocket engineers became part of our everyday speech. On September 9, 1959, I read that NASA had launched a mock-up of a Mercury manned capsule aboard a Big Joe rocket. I would mark that. It was a suborbital lob shot, and though the spacecraft was empty, the newspaper said it was opening the round of America's program to put men into space. I was thrilled. I started to think about spacecraft big enough for whole families to be launched to the moon, Mars, perhaps the stars themselves. As Reverend Richard had said, to look for new heavens and a new earth. I often felt a new earth for me would be an excellent plan. Most people in Coalwood were preoccupied with other matters more down to this earth. Not only had the steel company decided to sell the houses, the sewage and water systems and the churches were on the block as well. Would the mine itself be next? So I would definitely, guys, make a note of that the company is selling off the company houses, and that also the sewage and water systems. So they're concerned, what's going to happen with the mine itself. Mr. Van Dyke and Dad went to the union hall and sat around the table to inform the union leaders about the sell-off. I listened from the dining room while Dad in the kitchen gave Mom the blow-by-blow of that meeting. Dubonnet was all over me asking how the men were going to pay for their houses and everything else, Dad said. Well, how are they, Mom wondered. Because remember, guys, if they sell off the company houses and the people are going to stay there, that means they're going to have to pay for them a higher fee. And that's what he's saying, how are they going to pay for them? Remember, just a small amount of rent was being taken out of the checks when they were company owned. The company is going to loan them the money, almost no interest rate, 20 years to pay. That's still going to be money out of their pocket, Mom pointed out. And then when they've bought the house in 20 years, who's going to buy it from them when they want to retire and move? Did you ever stop to think the reason the company wants to sell everything is because they don't think the mine has a future either? That's what the people are saying. He used his good eye to look at her suspiciously. Who have you been talking to? It's common knowledge. Common knowledge is wrong, he growled. The company's selling the houses because they hired some fool efficiency expert who told them it's cheaper to sell them than keep them up. Captain Laird knew that 30 years ago. It wasn't efficiency he was after. He said if the miners lived in company houses, they'd feel like they were part of the company and be more loyal to it. Anyway, Van Dyke's going to drive up to Ohio and tell them this isn't such a good idea. We'd like to keep things in Coalwood just as they are. I think he'll be back with good news. Oh, Homer, Mom said in despair. A week later, Mom told me that Mr. Van Dyke had been fired. You should mark that. Mom guessed it was because he had lodged his complaint about the property sale but wasn't certain. In any case, a new general superintendent was being sent to Coalwood to make sure the sale of the houses and the churches and the utilities stayed on track. Dad retreated again to the mine. The union hall rattled with outrage. I rode by on my bike, going to the machine shop, and heard the chant, "Strike, strike, strike." The zinc sulfur powder mix was too loose, I decided, probably because it had air pockets in it. That's why our last rocket had exploded, so I would mark that. It was the same experience we had had with black powder and then again with potassium nitrate and sugar. Before, a binding agent had solved the problem with black powder, and melting had produced our reliable rocket candy. Melting zinc and sulfur was not a good plan. I didn't think it would surely detonate before the melting began, so I used dextrose and water to see if that would work as a binder. The resulting mix was just spewed feedly in the hot water heater. I wasn't sure why. The water probably caused the zinc to oxidize, Quentin said. How about we mix in gasoline? Odell proposed. Too dangerous, Quentin said. And I'm not so certain gasoline wouldn't react with the zinc in any case. We argued various liquids. Naphthalene? The mine had a lot of the solvent derived from coal tar, but it was too volatile. Diesel? Not volatile enough. Semi-solids such as paraffin? Too messy. Billy proposed alcohol, and Quentin's eyes lit up. Yes, alcohol is stable, and it'll evaporate quickly. Perfect. So they're wanting to use alcohol as a binder for the zinc. We looked at a scrounge master, Odell, and he grinned. There was only one place to go in Coalwood when you wanted to buy 100% pure 200 proof alcohol. I wonder where that place is. We're on the top of 316. Are you sure Tag's not going to catch us? I nervously asked again from the back seat of Roy Lee's car as we bounced up the rutted dirt road to Snake Root. Roy Lee, Odell, and I were on a quest that had seemed like a good idea when I'd first heard it. Now I was having some doubts. Tag couldn't catch a cold, Roy Lee said, gripping the steering wheel and turning it back and forth to dodge the potholes. He caught you and Odell in the mule barn. Roy Lee shrugged. That was different. This is a time-honored tradition. Every boy in town goes to John I's sooner or later. Because it was a Friday night, Roy Lee had to search for a parking place. A line of cars had already collected up and down the ditch line in front of John I. Blevins' moonshine place. I nervously handled the $4 we had scraped together. $4 would buy us a gallon of John I.'s finest. We waited covertly in the shadows until there was a gap in the traffic, and then clumped up the old wooden steps, worn smooth by years of traffic. A little girl with her hair tied up in braids swung on a porch swing and watched us with wide, round eyes. "Y'all be too young to buy shine," she pronounced. "Who are you, the moonshine police?" Roy Lee asked. "Nuh-uh," she shook her head. "I'm just smarter'n you." A huge bulk suddenly filled the door. "What y'all boys want?" The voice seemed to rise from a deep well. I held up the money. "Get on in here." The little living room had a broken-down couch and some easy chairs with the stuffing hanging out. A big old radio filled a dark corner, and on top of it was a cheap suitcase phonograph. A phonograph, guys, is what plays records, if you don't know. And what they mean is they used to, you can buy the retro ones now. It's the little small phonographs that close and hook together. I used to have one of those when I was a little girl. And, they've kind of become a popular thing now, and people are once again wanting to buy the records, or vinyls, they call them. The little living room had a broken couch and some easy chairs with the stuffing hanging out. A big old radio filled a dark corner, and on top of it was a cheap suitcase phonograph. Music I'd never heard before was playing, some sort of jazz. Hanging beads marked the door to the kitchen beyond, where 3 Negro men sat around the kitchen table. We're at the top of 317. They were playing cards and ignoring the business in the living room. John I. looked at us with his brow furrowed, as if he were trying to make up his mind about something, and then he put out his huge palm up. I counted out our dollars, and he nodded and limped through the beads. I knew John I.'s legend, how the timber had given way in his section, and how he held up the roof with his broad back until the other miners got out, so he's a big guy. When the roof finally caved, a piece of slate had cut off his foot at the ankle. That was the reason the company, meaning my dad, allowed him to make a living from his still on the ridge behind his house. So once again, hadn't you seen a pattern throughout the book that even though things aren't always his dad's fault, his dad cares about his men. He truly does, and he feels sorry for people. So you see this tough outer core, but time and time again, you see a caring father. He doesn't know how to show it outwardly in words, but he shows it by the things he does for people, and that means a lot. John I. came out with 4 fruit jars of clear liquid. Roy Lee expertly held one of them up to the light. "There's no water in here, is there?" "I don't cut my whiskey," John I. rumbled. "It's pure and bony fatty. Want a sip?" Roy Lee brightened. "Yeah." "I don't think we should," I said quickly. "It isn't for drinking anyway. It's for scientific purposes." I flinched. I hadn't meant to confess that. John I. held on to the other quart jars. "What y'all mean?" "Y'all ain't going to drink my stuff? This is the best corn liquor in the county. I'd be sacrilegious not to drink it." It'd be sacrilegious is what he means. "Ah, he's just kidding, John I," Roy Lee said, and pulled me off to a corner. "All these guys got razors on them," he whispered. "We got to be nice to them, or they'll cut our throats, and we got to make sure this stuff is pure, don't we?" "Well, you've never had a drink, have you?" So you've got to, one thing, know that he has sold him the moonshine for $4. Not exactly. I hadn't drunk it. We're at the top of page 318. Roy Lee cocked an eyebrow at me. "Man, you think Werner von Braun don't drink down at Cape Canaveral? I bet that's about all those rocket men do in between shooting off missiles. That and chasing women." I couldn't resist his logic. I nodded in agreement. "A-okay, John I," Roy Lee told him. Our host beamed and disappeared back into the kitchen, and I heard a cabinet squeak open and the tinkling sound of glasses being set up. The men at the table looked up from their cards and laughed. John I. brought in a tray with 3 filled shot glasses on it. He held it out to us, and we each daintily took the shine. Now, you know these men are already getting a kick out of it before they give it to the boys, because they know these boys are not drinkers, and they know what kind of effect it's going to have on them. Roy Lee held his glass up for a toast. To Werner von Braun, he downed the drink, smacked his lips, rolled his eyes, and croaked, "Dang, that's good." Odell followed suit and wiped his mouth, tears streaming down his cheeks. "Good," he shouted, but it came out a strained whisper because, guys, I've never drunk moonshine, but I know for a fact, I've heard from people that have, that it burns. Everyone looked at me. It was for Werner von Braun, after all. I tossed back the drink, not even letting the liquid roll across my tongue. It went straight back to my gullet and caught on fire. I nearly doubled over as I felt it burn all the way to my stomach. I tried to breathe, but nothing worked. Roy Lee pounded on my back. "How about that, old son? Is that rocket fuel or what?" "All systems go," I finally wheezed. "Want another?" John and I grinned, gold teeth flashing. We boys looked at each other and then held out our glasses. "To Werner von Braun," we bellowed. Notice they're getting to where they can't talk. While Odell and I sat down hard. Now I knew why all the chairs were busted in John and I's living room. Something later we were singing Blueberry Hill as Roy Lee guided us uncertainly down the dirt road from Snake Root. Tag pulled us over the moment we bumped up on the asphalt of the road that led down past the church. He fanned the sweet shine vapors away when Roy Lee rolled down the window. "Why, howdy, Roy Lee, Odell, Sonny, what y'all boys doing?" An hour and a half later, I stood in front of my mother in the kitchen. I was wobbly on my feet and had a sickly grin plastered on my face. "You're drunk?" she added in disbelief. I don't know if I was drunk or not, but I was definitely sick. I had just spent an hour bowing before a ditch with Odell. Tag drove each of us home in turn. Punishment, swift and sure, was left to the family. So make a note of that the boys got drunk at John I's moonshine place, and that Tag picked him up. And he was the officer there. So he picked him up. Notice he didn't take him to jail. He took him home. Back then, guys, you knew that's when people really punished their kids. And you knew they were going to get in trouble. They didn't need to go to the police station. Their parents would kill them. So, anyway, Roy Lee's mom reached up and grabbed Roy Lee by the ear and dragged him inside the house. Red came out onto the porch, heard the story, and pointed at the shed in his backyard. Guys, when you were going to the shed, that meant you were in major trouble. You didn't go there just to hang out and talk. The last I saw of Odell was him going down the path, head down, his dad close behind. While Mom contemplated me, I held with crossed arms to my chest the sack with our 4 quarts of precious shine. Tag had let us keep it when we had explained its real purpose. Amazingly, he'd believed us. "God almighty, boys," he cried, "why didn't you tell me? I'd have brought you some." I wasn't so drunk or sick that I'd forgotten how to manipulate Mom. "Mom, I'm really, really, really sorry." I wasn't. Oh, she laughed. "Not this time, Buster. There's no way you're going to wash the dishes or clean up your room or cook kidneys or anything else to get out of it. You're going to take John I's firewater down to the basement. Oh, I know it's for your rockets, and store it with all the other crazy stuff you've got down there that could probably blow this house to kingdom come. Then you're going to go upstairs and take a shower and brush your teeth and get the smell of liquor off you, and then you're going to bed. That's it? That's it until I figure out how I can do some real damage to you," she said with relish. "But I've got to get this over with," I cried. "Well, that's just tough, isn't it? Now get out of my sight. I never could stand a drunk." "Mom," I was whining, "hit me. Or think up something I've got to do." He doesn't want this to linger. Guys, you know how when you're in trouble, it's almost worse when it just keeps being put off. Because then you just get more nervous, wondering what's going to happen. She shook her head, smiling. "Nope." I sunk to my knees, put my head in her lap. "I'm sorry," I said into the folds of her dress. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." Mom touched my hair and then chuckled. "Sonny, I'm not going to punish you at all," she said. I looked up, stifling a smile. She saw the look on my face. "You little brat, I ought to hit you with a 2x4. But promise me you'll never drink that stuff again, and we'll call it square. Now take it into the basement and then do what I told you." So guys, basically, I think Mom knew how sick he was. She knew what he'd gotten the moonshine for. So I think she felt like what he'd already gone through and getting sick and throwing up probably was all the punishment he needed this time. I stood up stiffly, nodded, and went down into the basement with my white lightning. When Dad got home, he saw the jars and recognized them for what they were. He was in the kitchen and Mom when I came out into the hall after worshiping the toilet bowl again. "Elsie, did you know?" "Yes, Homer." "You plan on providing him an olive for his martini next?" In other words, you just going to let him do this? "We'll see." God bless my mother, I thought, and went right back inside the bathroom. Even with my head inside porcelain, I heard her and Dad laughing. It was the first time I'd heard either one of them laugh for a very long time. I wished I could have joined them. So again, Sonny likes to hear them laughing together. The temporary general superintendent sent down by the steel mill in Youngstown was a man named Fuller. He talked like a machine gun and had about as much charm. He didn't move into the turreted house on the hill. Guys, that was Van Dyke's house. So he's the new superintendent coming in that's replacing Van Dyke that got fired. So he's living in his home because that home was only for the superintendent. But took up lodging in the clubhouse, reinforcing his status as a temporary fixture. He called in Mr. Dunay and the other union leaders and told them that fair terms were to be given, but the houses were going up for sale immediately, and if anyone didn't like it, he'd have to get out. Fuller dared the UMWA to go on strike. That's the union, guys, waiving the last union agreement. "There's nothing in here that says we have to provide you a house, water, electricity, or anything else. Any man says different is a dang fool idiot." Mr. Dubonnet had to back down, and the sale proceeded. A utility out of Bluefield snapped up the sewer and the water lines, and within a month, the people in Coalwood started receiving bills for what they had always thought was naturally free. So what he's basically saying, the houses were sold, the utilities were sold to other companies. So now they're having to pay for things they didn't have to pay for before. For sale signs also went up in front of the churches. I had heard the people say at the big store, as if the company had chased even God out of town. So you do need to make a note of that, guys, that the churches are being sold and the utilities were sold, and that people are having to now pay for what was free. Reverend Richard and his congregation scraped up enough money to buy his church and save it. Reverend Lanier, however, lost his job when the Methodists took up the mortgage on his church. Although the Reverend was a Methodist too, he had been a salaryman for the company, and the denomination considered him tainted and wanted no part of him. The poor man had to pack up and leave. Mom said he went to California. So I would make note of that Reverend Richard was able to buy his church, but Reverend Lanier had to leave, guys, because he had been paid for the company. Mom said he went to California. I later heard he was on the radio out there. While the Methodists cast around for someone willing to come and serve in the wilds of West Virginia, the Coalwood Company Church, for the first time anyone could remember, was padlocked. The things really got bad. Mr. Fuller ordered a big cutoff, and many men were given their pink slips. Mr. Dubonnet called an emergency meeting at the Union Hall and invited the company to explain. Mr. Fuller didn't show. I heard Dad tell Mom he had been ordered not to go either. Mr. Dubonnet came once more to our house. Dad led him inside, and their fight was loud and long. I listened from my basement lab as they shouted at each other for nearly an hour, neither man giving an inch. I heard Mom finally go into the living room and order them both out. "I just won't abide this yelling in my house, Homer, John," she said. They were still arguing as they went out the door, bound for who knew where. I just kept working on my rockets. I mixed the moonshine into a zinc and sulfur compound and was rewarded with a thick gray composite that could be shaped like modeling clay. I squeezed it inside a toilet paper roll and let it dry under the hot water heater until the next weekend. With the other boys in attendance, I tossed the tube in the fire and had the door half closed when it went off with a huge whoosh. The velocity of the burn was such that it flung the door open, blew the stovepipe loose, and sent white smoke gushing into the yard along with us and the dogs. If that wasn't bad enough, when I went inside the kitchen, smoke had billowed through there too. I raced through the house, throwing open every window. The boys followed me inside and started flapping magazines and towels to clear it out. Mom and Dad weren't home. Dad was at the mine. Mom was shopping in Welch. Men hanging around the filling station jumped the fence and came running. Sure, the house was on fire. Someone yelled that they had called the fire department in Welch. Call back and stop them, I pleaded. There's no fire. It's okay. I heard stomping on the back porch, and Tag came inside, followed by a short man shaped like a powder keg. I hadn't met him, but I knew who he was. What the heck is going on in here? Mr. Fuller demanded, a stogie between his clenched teeth. So guys, before we move on, you do need to make a note that he was able to make his compound out of the moonshine and the zinc, but when they threw the putty that it had made into the fire, it just created this huge amount of smoke, and the fire department was called. And I would make a note that Mr. Fuller, remember, he's the new superintendent of the mine, and Tag show up. It's just them rocket boys, Tag said, grinning. You boys don't set your white lightning on fire, did you? White lightning? Mr. Fuller shifted his cigar, giving me the evil eye. With the other boys still fanning smoke out of the windows, I quickly explained to the new general superintendent about our rocket building and what the alcohol was for. He scowled. Where do you fire these things? Way out of town, I assured him, a long, long way away. Still on company property? Just barely, I said, wincing. His disapproval was made clear by the sour expression on his face. Mr. Fuller turned on his heel and left, with the constable close behind. When Mom got home, she wrinkled her nose at the sulfurous odor, then went to the basement and looked at the ruined hot water heater. Quentin and I came down and stood beside her, waiting for the wrath this time. I knew I wouldn't escape. Her shoulders were shaking. I thought from crying, but then I saw she was actually laughing. She put her arm around my waist and then pulled in Quentin too. You boys really are the light of my life, she said. I've been wanting to get rid of this old coal-fired thing for years. I'm going to make Homer get me an electric one now. Why, I'll just open up the spigot anytime I like, and there'll be all the hot water in the world, just like the Rockefellers. So, guys, you need to make note. One thing that Mr. Fuller is very upset, finding out that they do their rockets on just barely company property. But when the hot water is ruined and Mom finds out, she actually laughs and is happy because she's going to get a brand new electric water heater. Top of page 324, guys. Quentin stopped at the gate as he was leaving. You have the greatest mom in the world, he said. I looked over my shoulder. She's got her ways, I said. I was just hoping she'd use them on Dad when he got home and saw what we had done. Although I'm certain Mr. Fuller filled his ear about it, Dad made no comment on our abortive test. Junior from the big store arrived the next day with an electric water heater. It was installed and humming happily as I loaded Occ 22A on top of the washing machine. I decided to do the loading of our new propellant in sections, a few inches at a time. I pushed the zinc sulfur moonshine gumbo, and I had dubbed Zincoshine into the casement with a broom handle. After each section, I placed the open end of the casement toward a fan to dry. After 3 hours of drying, I loaded another section. It was slow going, but after a week, I had the rocket ready. We put up our posters, and Basil wrote us up in his paper. Over 200 people showed up the next weekend. The word was out that either we were going to have a great flight or we were going to blow the heck out of Cape Coalwood, just as we had Elsie's hot water heater. Either way, it was going to be a great show. Occ 22A didn't disappoint. It leaped with savage energy from the pad, zinged up the guide pole, and split the valley with its thunder. The crowd backed away and awed as the rocket disappeared at the top of a tremendous column of white, boiling smoke. Quentin spilled out of the blockhouse and aimed his theodolite skyward. Where is it? He screamed. I can't see it. None of us could. It had flown out of sight. Its huge smoke trail abruptly terminated. A little belatedly, guys, that's one of your words, so highlight belatedly. I started to worry over where it might land. I looked at our audience. Get in your cars, I yelled at them, waving my hand. Some of them waved back. Time, Quentin yelled out. I've got it, Sherman replied, looking at his father's watch, which he had borrowed. I kept searching the sky for any sign of the rocket, but I knew with my poor eyes I wasn't likely to be the one who saw it first. The crowd across from us was likewise engaged in searching the skies. I was starting to sweat. Where was it? Billy spotted it first. There, he yelled, pointing. I looked, but I still couldn't see it. Then I heard it. It was whistling as it came in. It sounded as if it were coming right on top of us. We ducked back into the blockhouse. A tree cracked behind us, and then there was the unmistakable sound of steel slamming into packed mountain earth. Whump! 38 seconds, Sherman said. Roy Lee looked at Sherman. What good is knowing the time? Sherman explained our new calculations to Roy Lee. Quentin and Sherman and I had discussed it after Miss Riley had begun to teach us a little Newtonian physics. A falling body accelerated toward the earth at 32 feet per second. The equation for finding how far it fell was S equals 1 over, and guys, I can already see that, 2 at the exponent of 2, or 16 times the square root of the time it took to fall. If one assumed a rocket took approximately the same time to reach altitude as it did to come back down, a good assumption since Zincoshine burned so fast our rockets were essentially free flyers the moment they left the pad. Then dividing the total time of flight in half, squaring it, and multiplying the result by 16, guys, I'm already confused. Math is not my subject, you know, gave us a rough estimate of the altitude reached. Half of 38, I do get that part, dividing the amount of time it takes to go up and down. So half of 38 was 19. The square of 19 was 361. And 16 times that was 5,776 feet. So guys, you do need to mark that it flew 5,776 feet. We had done it. We had broken the mile barrier. Mark that. Billy had run after the rocket and came racing across the creek, holding it high over his head. The crowd cheered from the road while we danced. A mile, a mile. We flew a mile. We're going into space, Quentin said after we stopped to take a breath. We're really going. I've been meaning to talk to you all about that, I said. I gathered the boys in close. I read where space begins at 30 miles. I think we can reach it. So, guys, how high did theirs go? They broke the mile barrier. Space begins at 30. At that moment, everybody was taken with the idea, even Roy Lee. Let's do it, he roared at the sky. Prodigious, Quentin bellowed back. We'll be on the cover of Life magazine for sure. After we'd calmed down a little, we cleaned up around the blockhouse and carried our rocket and our other gear to Roy Lee's car. I saw the last truck of the observers leaving. It was a company truck, and the man driving it was Mr. Fuller. The silvery cylinder burst forth in a fiery column of smoke and flame, racing the very wind as it soared into the sky. A messenger of these boys of Big Creek, these boys who use their brains, not brawn, who play not football with Apollo, but with Apollo's fire. Oh, fleet rocket, your thunder wanders down the valleys, startling deer and mountaineer alike. How high? The crowd cries. How high will it fly? The boys race from their bunker and go running down their slack dump firing range, the joy of youth and scientific interest playing across their delighted faces. Oh, rocket boys, how sweet thy missiles delight against the pale blue sky. A mile, they cry. We've flown a mile. The McDowell County Banter, October 1959. To take our next steps, we needed to work the nozzle equations in my book, but we were missing an important number, the specific impulse of Zincoshine. Specific impulse was, my book said, the thrust of a rocket produced when it burned a pound of fuel in 1 second. So I would mark what specific impulse is. To make this calculation, we needed a way to hold a rocket in place while we measured its thrust. Odell talked Mr. Fields, the butcher at the big store, into lending us a scale, the kind that hung from a ceiling and was used to weigh sides of beef, with the promise that it would be returned without so much as a scratch. So notice they borrowed the big hanging scale from the butcher at the big store. At Cape Coalwood, we clamped the scale to an underside of a plank that sat on two sawhorses. Then we ran a wire from the hook of the scale to the back of one of the rockets, which lay inside a slightly wider tube, which was in turn clamped to the plank with a piece of fashion strap steel. The idea, which was Quentin's, was that the rocket would move down the tube when ignited and be tugged to a stop by a cable attached to a spring, which was attached to a vertical stake in the ground. We'd watch the spring with binoculars and see how thrust was produced, and then divide the answer by the pounds of propellant burned and how long it took. The result would be the specific impulse number, and you don't have to know all that. That's a lot of detail. I just wanted you basically to know what specific impulse was and the definition. We had a good idea, but we got a bad result, a situation not totally unknown to the BCMA. When we lit the rocket, we called it OC 22B. It threw out a plume of flame and smoke and zipped down the tube, jerked the plank off the sawhorses, dived into the slack, bounced once, and then, with unerring accuracy, turned in our direction. It whizzed over the blockhouse, the scale on its stake following on the cable, bounced off a rock in the creek, and then flew up into the woods where it was stopped by a hornet's nest. The hornets, not pleased, chased us up the mountain on the other side of the slack. We crouched there and watched as they marauded, that's your other word, marauded, up and down the slack like a tornado. It was nearly dusk before they finally dissipated. We found the scale in pieces, so much for giving it back to the butcher. The BCMA spent the next 4 Saturday afternoons cleaning up the butcher's shop to work off our debt, so I would mark that. Mr. Fuller came up from his office and watched us. He didn't say anything, he just watched. And we knew he knew what we had done. Our next attempt at measuring thrust was a variation on the theme, this time using Mom's bathroom scale. I was absolutely certain that I would return it unscathed because this time we had a better test fixture design. It happened to be mine. Using some channel iron found behind the machine shop, we built what looked like a miniature oil derrick and placed it over the scale as a brace for a tube that held the rocket. We positioned a mirror on the derrick so that we could read the scale with binoculars. We put the rocket, this one named OC 22C, nose down inside the tube and ignited it. The scale and the concrete pad was in its way, so all it could do was push. I knew it would work, and it did. In the first seconds of the firing, we were able to read the scale. Then, unfortunately, OC 22C became a rocket jackhammer. It bounced up and down in its tube, attacking the scale. The scale survived the first few impacts, but then we heard a big spring and it flew apart. When the propellant hissed down to the completion, Mom's bathroom scale was scattered all over the pad. So now Mom's scale is destroyed. I tried to put the scale back together as best I could, managing to at least fit all the parts back inside and pound the frame back into a rough semblance of its previous shape. I put it back where I found it, hoping Mom wouldn't notice. The toilet was still flushing when Mom banged upon the door to my room. "I want a new scale," she announced, "and I want it within 1 day." Odell came up with the new bathroom scale for Mom. I didn't know where he got it, and I didn't ask him. I just placed it in the bathroom and backed out. We'd gotten ourselves into trouble, no surprise by then, but we had also had a shiny new working specific impulse number for Zincoshine. Almost anything was possible now. The flight of the OC 22D was to be the final flight in the series that used countersunk nozzles. I had the machinist make just one minor adjustment with OC 22D to shrink the size of its fins. I had noticed our old rocket candy rockets wobbling when they broke the plane of the mountains and got caught in the wind stream coming across the ridgeline. Smaller fins, I thought, would keep that from happening and make them fly truer. What I didn't know was that Odell and Sherman, who had taken on the job of setting our rockets up on the pad, had also noted the wind's effect on flight. They had been compensating for it by aiming our rockets at a small angle against whatever direction the wind was coming. It was, as it happened, a very windy day when OC 22D made its flight. The wind was whistling across the slack dump. I studied the clouds. They were scudding along in the same direction toward the west, away from the center of Coalwood. In an attempt to compensate, Odell and Sherman leaned the launch rod more than usual against the wind. I was way too busy getting the blockhouse organized to notice what they were doing. I ran our ignition wire, made sure Quentin and Billy had set up their theodolites, checked with Roy Lee that our new fancy-looking firing console was in working order, and then called for the boys to go to their stations. The word had spread about our last launch that our big new rockets were potentially dangerous to spectators. It didn't keep them from showing up, but I saw some of the miners had brought their helmets with them. Roy Lee ran our BCMA flag up the pole. That was the final signal. I looked at the flag with some concern. It was snapping in the wind. Pop, pop, pop. I put my worry aside. This was a big, heavy rocket. It should fly straight and true. I went inside the blockhouse and knelt beside the wooden console Sherman and Odell had built. They had even installed a switch salvaged off an old electric train transformer. I toggled it, and the Zincoshine propellant rocket blasted off with a savage roar. It flew straight, slicing without flinching through the plain of the mountaintops. Sherman counted 10, 11, 12. I watched as the smoke trailed off from the arc, and then it disappeared, still on a heading for Coalwood. "No!" I yelled, horrified. Sherman looked up at his watch. "Huh?" Roy Lee saw what I was seeing. "Oh, no!" All of the other boys looked up the valley, and so did our audience. In unison, almost everybody repeated exactly what Roy Lee had said. We ran for his car, the crowd scattering before us. We roared up the road, plastering our faces to the car windows, looking for any sign of our wayward arc. "You know," Quentin said learnedly, "I suspect the velocity of a rocket also affects its stability at moments of maximum stress." "Shut up, Quentin. Perhaps there are ratios of wind pressure to velocity that can be mathematically calculated. Interesting, I think." "Shut up, Quentin." Frog Level was peaceful, so we kept going. Up ahead at Middletown, we saw a crowd near the road. People were running up to see whatever it was. Roy Lee moaned, "We've killed somebody." ARC 22D had landed in the field beside Little Richard's church. A patch of flat ground was often used for pickup touch football and softball games. Totally panicked, certain we had killed some unsuspecting playgrounder, we pushed through the crowd and found our rocket buried in the grass with only its fins and nozzles showing. The odor of sulfur was strong. I was so relieved, I started to laugh, and everybody in the crowd laughed with us. "God, you boys will be flying all the way up to Washington, D.C. You keep it up this way," Tom Tickle roared. Good old Tom was a miner who had always supported us. Roy Lee got out a shovel from the trunk of his car and began to dig the rocket out, while people talked about where each of them was when it fell and what it sounded like and how it shook the ground. Mr. Fuller showed up in his truck. He took one look. "You boys are a dang menace," he announced. "You fired off your last rocket in this town." So you need to make sure that you know that the ARC 22D landed in the playground in Coalwood. So Mr. Fuller is threatening them, saying they won't be firing anymore. "Here we go again," I thought. "Now, looky here," the Reverend Richard said to Mr. Fuller. "Don't you be talking about stopping these boys. We're proud of them." "You can't shut our rocket boys down," Tom said. "Leave them alone." Weren't nobody hurt? A grumble of assent rose from the crowd. Mr. Fuller surveyed us. "They fly on company land, and from what I've observed, they do it with company property. I'm the company, and I'm telling you they won't fly anymore." "Sir," Reverend Richard said, "you may be the company, but these men and these ladies around you, they is the town." "Go, Reverend." "The boys keep flying," Tom said, stepping up to Mr. Fuller. "You can sell our homes, charge us for the air we breathe, I guess, but you ain't stopping these boys." So I would make a note of that Tom, one of the miners, and the Reverend are standing up against Mr. Fuller. A woman I recognize as Reverend Richard's piano player jostled Mr. Fuller. "Our town was just fine before you came," she told him. "Now don't you go pulling those Yankee airs around here, mister, saying what you gonna do and what you ain't gonna do." Mr. Fuller retreated to his truck. He stuck out his jaw in my direction. "I'll be talking to your dad." "Keep flying, boys," Tom said to us. "Keep on putting those rockets in the sky." But it might be nice if you aimed a little more that way, somebody else said, pointing back to Cape Coalwood. As soon as I got home, Dad called me up to the mine. I took a deep breath and then trudged up the path. The door to his office was ajar. He was pondering, a mind diagram with one hand held over his bad eye. He turned at my knock, and when I saw him, I was shocked at his appearance. Not so much his watery, ruined eye, but his gaunt face. I had seen little of him since the announcement that the houses were to be sold. He reached for his hat. "Let's go for a ride," he said, and walked me to his truck. I noticed he had a bit of a limp, although the accident had not, to my knowledge, hurt his legs. He seemed somehow smaller than I remembered him being. I don't know, but to me, guys, it sounds like his father's not doing so well. Remember, he has black spot on the lungs, and they haven't talked about that recently. I wanted to ask him where we were going and why, but I held back. He drove us slowly down the road, past our house and the Coalwood School, and through the corridor of houses that led to the center of town. I was startled to see that one of the houses across the creek was in the process of being painted a bright yellow. In the line of houses still painted company white, it stood out, a bright, brave statement that things weren't the same anymore. It was a sold house, one of the first, and Dad looked at it and wiped his mouth as if he were throwing away the words he wanted to say. We drove past the community church, the cross on top slightly askew. That means it's, not straight. The padlock on its double doors was huge, more suitable for the gates of heaven or hell, I thought, than a little West Virginia church. We drove past a Little Richard's church and then down through Frog Level. It was clear we were headed for Cape Coalwood. "I thought you should see this, Sonny," Dad said, when I looked at him questioningly, rather than just hear about it. When Cape Coalwood came into view, I saw a bulldozer covering up our launch pad. Mr. Fuller was walking beside the bulldozer, directing the driver. Boards that had once been the BCMA blockhouse were stacked alongside the road, and there was a single strand of barbed wire across the entrance to the slack dump. Hanging on it was a flat, square plate with a message from Mr. Fuller, the company, and the steel mill that owned it. The sign said, "No trespassing." So that's what his dad took him to see, where they basically bulldozed their launch area and put a sign saying "No trespassing." My blood boiled at the sight of it. "Dad, you gave me this place." He gripped the steering wheel and stared at the bulldozer. "You promised to never let another rocket land in Coalwood." We're at the top of 334. "That was an engineering error, and we've already fixed it. Mr. Fuller made this decision," he said, "and he had every right to do it." "What right? You gave us that lumber. We didn't steal it. The same with the cement for the launch pad." Dad considered me for a moment as if trying to decide whether to proceed. "Listen, little man," he said finally. "There's not a dang thing I can do about this. You don't like the way things are around here? Go to college and then come back here. In a few years, I bet you'd be running the whole place." My potential for arrogance made a sneak attack on me. I said, "Dad, when I get out of this sinking hole, wild horses couldn't drag me back." He said the wrong thing. My words were meant to hurt him, and they did. He sucked in a breath and raised his hand at me. I waited, knowing I'd gone too far, but no blow fell. He let his hand drop into his lap. "I can't believe you'd say that about Coalwood," he said. I was instantly sorry. Dang me and my smart mouth. Just then, Roy Lee and Odell came racing up in Roy Lee's car. They got out and surveyed the scene, looking to me for guidance. I got out of the truck and led them to the stack of our lumber. I picked up a board, and they did too. "We're going to build our blockhouse back," I said. Another car arrived, this one with Sherman and his dad in it. Then another, this one with some of our machinists, and then another with Mr. Dubonnet, Tom Tickle, and some of the other miners. They all stood at the barbed wire. Dad got out of his truck and limped over to where we were. "Homer, this isn't right," Mr. Dubonnet told him. "This is company business," Dad replied, without his usual vehemence. "We ain't company," Tom said. We're union." "You men go on home now," Dad said, but there was no force to his words. "Not until we build back the boys' blockhouse," Tom said. The men pulled down the barbed wire and started to cross the slack with the lumber. Mr. Fuller ran up and started yelling at them, but they were pushed past him. Mr. Dubonnet stopped at the bulldozer and had a word with the operator, who immediately started to scrape off our pad. I turned at the blockhouse site and watched Dad walk over to Mr. Fuller, who was huffing and puffing and yelling at everybody. Dad touched him on his shoulder, and he whirled and went up on tiptoe, yelling in Dad's face. Dad took it for a while and then suddenly reached out, clutched the little man's leather jacket, and lifted him right up off the ground. Roy Lee pointed over at them. "Guess your dad's negotiating," he chuckled. Mr. Dubonnet looked and laughed aloud. Mr. Fuller stomped off the slack, and Dad came over and drew me aside. "You've got a wide open field. If you want tubing, machine work, aluminum sheeting, just tell Leon Farrow and I'll sign his requisition. If you fail now, you can't blame me. You'll have only yourself to blame. Understood?" I grinned at him. "Understood, sir." So guys, once again, I mean, that's touching to me. Here's his dad. I think his dad is starting to feel defeated by what's going on in the mine. And look what he's done once again for Sonny. Guys, it's really touching to see that against all these odds, against everything that's happening to Coalwood, and against everything that's happening to the mine that Homer has loved and taken so seriously all these years, in the end, he's got his son's back. So guys, as you notice, we've been reading for a while and it's gotten dark on us, so it is time to go. That was the end of chapter 21, Zincoshine. I hope you took good notes. As a matter of fact, I hope you made note of the fact that Dad stood up against Mr. Fuller and the deal and what he told Sonny. We don't know exactly what he told Mr. Fuller, but we know that whatever he did, he made way for Sonny to be able to build everything back and still keep that as his launch pad. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed that chapter. And you guys, have a good night, and I'll see you next time.